Chapter 22, Act 22, Edge's Tale. Act 22, Edge's Tale. The Daydream Maiden. Edge licked his fingertip and flipped through the paper bills one last time for good measure. Counting out the same amount he had previously, he tapped the bills on the table to straighten them into a neat pile, sliding them back toward the elderly woman who had initially made the delivery.
100,000 gil, exactly. Please deposit into the usual account.
The woman cocked an eyebrow, hesitating as her palm hovered over the stack of bills.
You mean to deposit the entire amount, Your Highness?
Edge nodded, gesturing toward a small sack next to him stuffed with gil coins.
Yes, this should be sufficient for what I need. The rest of it can be deposited.
The woman's palm fell upon the money, sweeping it away in the blink of an eye. Edge smiled and stood up, his chair groaning as it scraped across the inn's limestone floors. The woman did not move to follow him, but instead looked up at the king, her lips pursed.
Your Highness, I know that these proceeds from the treasures you have been selling have been getting funneled directly into Mist. You don't have to sneak about, this is a different Evelyn than even a few years ago. Your people would understand that those treasures are your inheritance from the late king and queen and that they are yours to do with as you please, not to mention all the treasure you found on the moon 17 years prior.
Edge paused, his fingers gently drumming over the scuffed tabletop. He smiled kindly. He had wondered how long it would take for someone to finally confront him over this little shell game he had been dabbling in for the past few months.
Maybe so, but it would be a hard sell to explain why Mist, of all the places in the world, especially when Evelyn was hit just as hard during the war. But Evelyn is doing fine,
the woman frowned.
Unless there is something you know that your subjects don't.
Edge shook his head quickly. His schemes, no matter how ridiculous over the years, had never involved anything fraudulent in regard to his people. He was fine with shouldering the reputation he had earned as a young man for being irresponsible and flighty, but took his duty as the protector of Evelyn as seriously as any of the other royals on their planet, perhaps more so in some instances.
No. Evelyn is fine, as you say. It's more of what I'd rather leave unsaid, I suppose.
And a promise is a promise? Right, Rydia? The woman nodded, finally rising and patting the crossbody she had slung over her shoulder containing the cash.
It was not my intention to question your wishes, Your Highness. I merely wanted to let you know that we can drop the pretense between us, if there was any in the first place. I appreciate it,
Edge grinned. He wished all the elderly people he knew were as chill as this lady. Maybe the Seneschal and Zangetsu could take some much-needed lessons from her.
And speaking of pretense, have you found out yet just who exactly our generous benefactor is? I have to say, I'm rather surprised some of these pieces sold at auction this time. I thought some of them were far too steeped in Evelynessa history to be of any interest to an outsider.
The woman couldn't help but chuckle. He asked her the same question every time they met.
Alas, the bidder remains anonymous, and my contacts at the auction house remain as tight-lipped as ever. All I've managed to deduce is that they have a lot of money to burn, and may possibly live in the Capo area. Perhaps they are a scholar interested in the world's history. Scholar and rich don't often go together in the same sentence,
Edge smirked.
At least, in my experience. You would be surprised at some of the money some of these old families are sitting on,
the woman shrugged.
At any rate, I'd best get to work on this, Your Highness. You'll let me know if anything else comes up. I will,
Edge nodded.
Thanks again.
The woman left first, as she always did when they met like this. Today, the inn had been fairly empty. Edge hadn't even been bothered to get them a private room, deciding that sitting in the common area next to the now extinguished fireplace was less suspicious. The woman minding the inn that day had been a sweetheart named Emily who had unfortunately been rendered half-deaf in the bombing during the war. She had been in a room where one of the Firaga spells that had been let loose by Ruby Kant directly exploded. As a result of her handicap, Edge hadn't bothered to find an excuse to shoo her out. She had been bobbing her head to a radio broadcast that was playing softly behind the counter, and had been paying them no mind.
Goodbye, Your Highness,
Emily chirped as Edge exited the common room and strode past the check-in counter. Edge blew her a kiss in return, and she blushed wordlessly, sliding the dial up higher on the radio. AHHH. That reminds me. Now that my chores are done and the others are out of my hair for a bit, I can get to some reading. Edge's hand flew to the concealed parcel that was still stuffed in his obi, a grin spreading across his face. The return of the second moon be damned, if their peaceful days really were coming to an end, then he needed to take advantage of the quiet while he still could. But as he climbed the spiral stairwell that took him to his bedroom high atop the western tower, he found his enthusiasm waning with each step that took him closer to his ever-elusive goalpost. By the time he reached the threshold of his bedroom, his legs felt as if they were gradually petrifying, and his heart was no longer dancing excitedly at the idea of a half-hour of uninterrupted erotica. Locking the door of his rather Spartan bedchamber behind him, Edge flopped into the bed, pulling out the magazine and tearing off the brown paper wrapping. It took him 5 minutes to realize that he had been staring at the cover, unblinking, and yet still had no idea what it was he was looking at. The cover model was a blur of swelling peach and strategically styled honey blonde hair. He groaned and tossed the magazine aside, pushing his fingertips into his temples and closing his eyes. He had the sobering realization that he was too worried about the others to do much of anything. What had he been thinking, sending the Evelyn 4 off like that to investigate the crystals? Yes, they had begged him to go, but really, what did they know about what they were getting themselves into? Hell, what did he even know? It wasn't that he didn't have faith in his disciples, that was what they liked to call themselves. He still wasn't sure how he felt about that, being that he had never actually formally accepted them as students. The truth was, they had all been in more dangerous situations since even before the Evelyn 4 had been formed than just traveling outside the country to babysit the crystals. But the return of the moon added a new layer of danger to the entire gambit. No one in Evelyn, save for himself, knew of the horrors that had dwelled on that satellite when he set foot on it 17 years ago, and even if this wasn't the same moon as before, there was still something sinister about its sudden appearance. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, like they had been quietly infiltrated by the enemy, and now it was already too late. Gekao. Zhang Etsu. Izaoi. Tsukinawa. I meant what I said. Do not throw your lives away for me. Not even for Evelyn. Never again do I want our people to suffer on the world's behalf. It had been long before the war that Edge had met the first of his disciples, the one who had founded what had become the Evelyn 4. He and Gekao had spent most of their childhood and adolescence together, although quite unwillingly. Edge couldn't remember a time where he and Gekao had ever really gotten along. They were just opposite enough to annoy the living hell out of each other. Edge knew now that perhaps he was more of a miserable jerk than he should have been, but he and Gekao had never formally made acknowledgement of that. Eventually, the time came when their paths began to naturally diverge. Edge was the crown prince, after all, and Gekao was training to become a teacher of ninjutsu so he could one day crush the spirits of any little future Edges. That was Edge's interpretation of Gekao's ambitions. Perhaps if he had asked Gekao, he would have gotten a different explanation. Edge hadn't thought about Gekao of Fire again until after he had returned home from the war. It wasn't long after he had formally been crowned as the King of Evelyn when Gekao appeared in his throne room one late summer night. The unannounced encounter had entwined their fates once again. Evelyn, 17 years prior.
Your Young Highness, one of the leaders of the Evelyn Cave evacuation effort is here to give you a status report.
Edge blinked drowsily, not bothering to push away the silky silver hair that had flopped over his eyes.
Hey. But I was just about to go to bed. I was having the greatest dream.
He let out an obnoxious yawn, and Seneschal shook his head.
Your Young Highness, may I remind you that your role does not have designated office hours? Would it kill you to engage with one more of your subjects before you leave to have whatever vulgar dream you are looking forward to? Vulgar? I'll have you know that my dreams of late have been nothing but romance and the stuff of fairy tales. You're a dirty old man for thinking otherwise.
Seneschal rolled his eyes.
Going on again about that daydream maiden of yours? Or have you finally moved on to someone that has the poor judgment to marry you so Evelyn has some sense of stability? Ouch, Seneschal.
Edge clasped his hand to his heart, wincing.
You know, you've really changed in the time I was away. Now you're a cruel, dirty old man. It would be insensitive of me to take a bride during this time of transition. Yeah. How can I be happy when so many of my people continue to suffer?
Sure, Seneschal shook his head.
So in that case, you can listen to the last status report of the evening and be on your way.
Before Edge could leap up and stop him, Seneschal turned toward the throne room doors, shouting out.
Please come in. His Highness will see you now. Bastard.
Edge hissed, and Seneschal took his place in the rear of the throne room, shaking his head. The doors opened hesitantly, and a slightly hunched figure wrapped in a red cloak stepped into the failing light of the few candles they had been able to retrieve from the caverns. Evelyn was still in crisis mode in terms of supplies. Shipments coming in from Baron and Fable were helping tremendously, but they all went to the survivors who still had to take shelter in the caverns beneath the Tower of Babel first. Construction on Eblin Castle was going as swiftly as possible so that more people could come home, but it did not amount to much when a majority of your workforce was injured or dead.
Excuse me for the intrusion, Your Highness,
the figure said, bowing deeply.
I was just passing through for the night, and thought I would share the progress we've made today before returning to the caverns.
Yes, yes, Edge nodded, gesturing with his palm for the man to stand.
Come closer, it feels like I'm talking to a shadow, I'm not going to bite.
The man chuckled, stepping further into the light.
I would not be so sure about that.
Edge blinked, grasping the arms of his throne.
Wah. Gekao, is that you? Yes, Your Highness,
the man nodded.
It's been a long while, hasn't it? Yeah,
Edge flushed. He couldn't exactly remember how long, but it was long enough for him to forget about Gekao's existence entirely. He was flooded with a distressing mix of relief and shame. He was glad Gekao was still alive after Ruby Kent had torched Eblin. The same couldn't be said about many of their other classmates, but it wasn't like the two of them had ever buried the hatchet, and now they were in two very different positions from when they had just been rival students. For once, Edge was rendered speechless. Gekao stared up at the king cordially, and Edge sank slightly in his throne. He couldn't help but think maybe Gekao was enjoying this. His black eyes were crinkled like he was remembering a hilarious joke, and a wide smile was tugging at his lips.
We're projecting that the inn will be completed tomorrow,
Gekao said, plowing through the tension effortlessly.
Another airdrop of medicines arrived today from Baron, which was enough to heal 3 more men who will join my team effective tomorrow. Once the inn is completed, we'll be looking to move the sickest citizens there immediately so that they can better recover outside the dampness of the caverns. Do we have permission to proceed?
Edge tucked his hair behind his ear. He was shocked that so much progress had been made on the inn so quickly. He knew from prior reports that a new squad leader had taken over the inn effort, but he had no idea that person had been Gekao.
Yes, of course,
Edge replied, trying to suppress the surprise in his voice.
It was a great idea to prioritize the inn. Just the change in the environment alone should greatly aid the recovery rate, and then we'll have more people to help build before winter sets in. Brilliant work, Gekao of the Fire,
Seneschal smiled.
A fine update to end our evening on. If I have Your Highness permission to take my leave, I will just be making my final rounds of the castle for the night and retiring.
Edge would have normally let out a sarcastic huff, but felt that in Gekao's presence, he should perhaps just act a little more kingly.
Just be on the watch for any pitfalls, Seneschal. I would hate for you to tumble to the basement and not be found for days. Yes, sire,
Seneschal smirked, sweeping past Edge and Gekao.
Good night.
When Seneschal had made his exit, Gekao crossed his arms, smiling more.
If I may, Your Highness, I had one more item of note to share with you. Please, just call me Edge.
Edge frowned.
This is a little too formal for my taste. Well, this is a formal request.
Gekao laughed, and Edge raised an eyebrow.
As you may have heard on your own, Your Highness, there have been some rumblings about what we are to do about Eblin's defenses now that the construction efforts are starting to come together.
Edge tilted his head.
I have heard some of it, but my position has been clear. I want our priority to be the rebuild of Eblin first and foremost. I know people are anxious to throw themselves back into training and militaristic efforts. That's a routine for the majority of our population that has been interrupted for some time, after all. But I'm not excited about the prospect of immediately building up an army once again. I'd rather build up the spiritual welfare of our people, first, by giving them a warm, safe place to live and grow again. I understand that,
Gekao frowned.
But surely you realize that the discipline of ninjutsu aids in spiritual welfare as well? Eblin is a very special kingdom, my lord. The hearts of her people are anxious to find comfort in the traditions of old and to know that what is being built anew will be well protected for the future.
Edge looked down, closing his eyes. Oh, it hurt so very much to hear that, because it was all truthful, and it went flagrantly against the growing fear that had been blossoming in his heart since the day he had confronted Ruby Kent in the caverns of Eblin and had been utterly defeated. He had never spoken about his worry aloud before, but for some inexplicable reason, he felt safe making Gekao of Fire his impromptu confidant.
But Gekao, I ask you this. What good did the ninjutsu arts do us before?
Edge asked softly.
We still lost everything. Our home, our king and queen, our past, and quite nearly our future. I could not even defeat the archfiend that did this to us by myself. It took the powers of many to rid him of this planet. How can I put my faith in traditions that ultimately failed us all? How am I supposed to know that is truly the road we need to pave for the future of the new Eblin?
Gekao pressed his hands together, taking a step forward. Edge heard the click of delicate charoite prayer beads dangling from his wrists.
You are still hurting from the assault the war waged upon your heart, Edge, that much I can see. If you cannot yet bring yourself to pour your faith into such a path, then pour it into me instead, and let me take some of the burden away from you. I'm not sure what you mean. There are others who feel the same as me, who don't want to watch all of the old Evelyn fade away, who still believe we can be all we were before but also evolve into something new. I agree with you, we should be focusing on getting back on our feet as swiftly as possible, while we have the aid of the new friendships you have gifted Evelyn and fortuitous weather. But there is a need to protect that future we are building. Maybe ninjutsu isn't the only way, but I know in my heart it's at least part of that way. Let me prove it to you, by granting me the leave to do so once the rebuilding effort is done.
Edge stood up from his throne, his fingers drumming on his hips.
You want me to give you carte blanche in developing our kingdom's military? And no. Nothing like that.
Gekao gasped, raising his hands.
I merely want to assist you in raising up the future Evelyn, but at the same time, I wanted to be forthcoming about my feelings in regard to how I feel the ninjutsu arts should play a role. You could think of it more like a master-servant relationship, if that's simpler. You are undoubtedly the most powerful ninja in the kingdom now, after all. HMMMPH,
Edge shook his head, turning away.
That's more of the Gekao I remember. Hey.
Gekao blinked.
I'm not in the market for a servant,
Edge muttered,
or for a bunch of lackeys to suck up to me. But if things are as you say they are, it may be wise for me to have someone like you learn how to become my eyes and ears in the field, so to speak. Evelyn is no longer an isolated entity, we're the newest debutante at the world's ball, thanks to the war that embroiled the entirety of the planet. If there are others who truly feel the same as you, then you should have no problem establishing yourself as their leader.
Right.
Your Highness.
Edge raised his chin defiantly.
Back to that? You used my name just moments ago. What happened?
Gekao shook his head.
I think between that moment and now, the nature of our relationship changed yet again. If you are being serious about honoring my request, I will call you Master Edge henceforth. When have I ever not been serious?
Edge exclaimed. Gekao stared at him blankly, and Edge scratched the back of his head.
Okay, forget I asked that. Fine, call me whatever you want, as long as the job gets done, I don't care if you call me Queen Rosa. Now, is that all we have to discuss for the night? This has turned into something far more than I had the mental capacity for. Yes, Master.
Gekao smiled.
I am sorry to have taken up so much of your time. Please have a good night. You as well,
Edge replied warily, and watched as Gekao took his exit. Edge shook his head, collapsing back down into his throne and swinging his legs over the arm. The thought of climbing all the way up into the top of the unfinished tower his well-guarded room was tucked away in was suddenly very exhausting. He could make do with sleeping in here for the night. Curling his body so that his head and shoulder pressed against the back of the throne, Edge closed his eyes and let out a low, steady exhalation of breath, his entire body deflating and shrinking within the frame of the throne. As happy as I am to see someone like Gekao eager to play a role in Evelyn's development, there's surely no way that simpering boy from school will be able to get anyone to buy into his vision. Right? Current day. But Gekao did it, Edge ruminated as he stared at his bedchamber ceiling. I nearly fell out of my throne from laughter when the first person he brought to me who said he wanted to join the cause was a 50-something-year-old man who wanted to learn how to become a ninja and who hadn't even lifted a shuriken his entire life. I told Gekao that if he were being serious, that he should try to recruit someone like Aoi. She had impressed me with her in-depth espionage that she had conducted by herself all around the world after fleeing Ruby Kent, and had single-handedly ensured her cousins and her own survival during the attack. I thought she would be a hard nut to crack. She was a rebellious teenager who could manipulate most anyone she wanted into doing her bidding, but when she pledged her allegiance to what they had started calling the Eblin 3, I realized Gekao was going to do whatever it took to see his dream through, and that there were people out there that actually believed in him. Edge sat back up in bed, shaking his head, which now felt slightly less overstuffed with unwanted thoughts. This was driving him crazy, sitting here and doing nothing like this, and really, what could he say to his people right now about the moon? Absolutely nothing of importance. What he needed to do was talk to someone like Cecil. Had he awoken and seen the moon yet? Edge glanced over, noticing that his window was still open from his great escape earlier that morning. Before he could stop himself, he crossed the room, easing himself back through the window, and this time, instead of running toward the castle keep across the roof, he instead climbed further up the tower, hauling himself up onto a parapet that gave him an unobstructed view of the western Eblan desert. The climb was fluid and effortless. Edge hadn't realized he had gone anywhere until he found himself perched upon the parapet. For nearly 15 minutes, he stared listlessly before him, observing the Tower of Babel as the ceaseless desert winds stung his watering eyes. He made no motion to protect his face, daring to not even blink as he slightly shifted his weight to his other foot, sand grinding beneath his boot. The slight glow that had seemed to embrace the tower that morning was gone, although Edge was still not entirely convinced it had been there in the first place. It wouldn't be the first time in his life he thought something existed that no one else could see. Why am I out here again? Edge frowned. For just a moment, it felt like something was calling to me. Just as he was about to give up and start climbing back down from the secret spot, Edge saw a flash of red light out of the corner of his eye. It had only been for a second, but when he turned his head, he had been able to see the tower's normally ivory facade glow a bright, menacing red. It now faded back to the gentle glow he had observed upon waking, unnoticeable to anyone else who had not become as obsessed with the tower as himself in the last 17 years. By evening's fall, Edge was visibly jittery with impatience. He could feel his eye involuntarily twitch whenever he heard footfalls that he thought might be one of the Eblan 4 returning home, but had turned out to be one of the many stray cats in the castle that kept the desert mice population in check. He had played the role of obedient king for the remainder of the day, having eventually retreated back to his throne room to conduct the day's business that didn't involve stealth moving of funds or lad rags. He had entertained the worries and queries of a few soldiers and villagers who had wandered in to question the return of the moon with a graciousness that made Seneschal's eyebrows leap so high that they nearly stuck to the ceiling.
Your young highness, are you quite all right?
Seneschal questioned when another villager had taken their leave.
Is it too hopeful for me to think that this morning's lecture was the one that finally sunk into that thick skull of yours? Alas, it is too hopeful,
Edge frowned, shaking his head.
I've heard no word from the others. At a minimum, I would have thought Zangetsu would have returned home by now. I kept him the closest to Eblan for a reason. What do you think is going on? They're doing what you requested of them, your highness,
Seneschal said gently, planting his hand over Edge's shoulder and squeezing with a paternal affection.
It's good that you are worried for them, it means you care about what is most important. But you need to have faith that they are doing everything that needs to be done. It's not in a ninja's blood to leave any stone unturned. I just can't shake the feeling that something big is happening, or already has happened, right under our noses. The wheels have started turning. What is it that I'm missing?
Cecil. Rosa. Rydia. I'm worried about you too. But I can't put my finger on why.
Your young highness.
Seneschal sighed.
Please, don't do this to yourself. It will be time for dinner soon. What would you like to do? I'll dine alone tonight,
Edge muttered.
I need some time to think. I'll take care of the arrangements,
Seneschal offered, pulling his hand away.
You did the right thing, sending the Eblan 4 in your place to check on the crystals. You are needed here, my lord. I know you don't think that, but it was good for your people to be able to see you today. Things are different from when you were a prince. People look up to you now and need you.
Edge turned away, leaning his cheek into his hand. Seneschal quietly took his leave, and the throne room was steeped in silence once more. A half-hour later, there came a swift knock on the door, and before Edge could grant entry, it flew open, revealing a harried Lady Chisaki, clutching a silver tray with white knuckles. She kicked the door shut behind her and practically threw the tray at Edge, her nostrils flaring.
What's your problem?
Edge cried, just barely managing to leap from his seat and grab the food before it exploded all over him.
And since when do you work in the kitchens? I intercepted the maid,
Chisaki huffed.
Since Seneschal made it explicitly clear that no one was to disturb his highness this evening. I guess there still is some venom yet in those old fangs,
Edge grinned, retrieving an apple from the tray and taking a large bite. The snap of the apple's flesh being torn apart rang throughout the chamber like a rebel yell.
Since you took the time to disobey my orders, I'll reward you with my undivided attention. What can I do for you? What were you thinking, sending my son to Mysidia on a whim, with this wicked moon's return?
Chisaki seethed, cutting straight to the heart of the matter.
And why did I have to find out he had been deployed on a mission from a random guard who saw him leave? Is Izaway at least with him?
Edge chewed the apple slowly and methodically, his eyes never leaving hers. Finally, he swallowed, right when he thought her head was about to explode clean off her shoulders like a bomb.
He wanted to go. Liar.
Chisaki hissed.
No, really.
Edge laughed, shaking his head.
Come on, Chisaki, he's practically a grown man now, and he's spent plenty of time in my city before, he loves it there and knows it as well as Evelyn. There was no one better suited for this mission. Izaway is in Troya, he doesn't need a babysitter. But he's normally not in any kind of danger in my city,
Chisaki moaned.
I know you think it's cute, doting on my Lapin's desire to learn black magic even though you and I both very well know his place is here, where he will actually be successful with his natural talents for ninjutsu, but to send him so far from home when this moon has returned? You overstep your bounds.
Edge could feel his heart skip a beat. Of course, he had known Tsukinawa could be in danger this time, anyone too close to the crystals could have been. The crystals in the Tower of Babel held a sinister symbiotic relationship. After all, when they were combined, the celestial path that connected the blue planet to the moon was blown wide open, an ample opportunity for invaders. Chisaki pounced on the hesitance she saw flicker in Edge's eyes.
If anything happens to him, I'll... I know, you'll slit me from my belly to my throat,
Edge muttered, pushing his dinner aside and standing up.
But the only person responsible for Tsukinawa's life is Tsukinawa, you need to remember that. You were once a ninja too, you know. Would you have held your master responsible for any of your foolish decisions? Tsukinawa signed up for this life when he joined the Evelyn 4, and this is what you signed up for when you decided to become a parent in the first place. What if he doesn't want to stay in Evelyn when his training is complete? You can't stop him. He's not bound by anything to stay, things are different now.
Chisaki looked down, her bejeweled hair ornaments sinking forward morosely in her pile of ebony hair. Edge sighed, closing the distance between them and wrapping his arms around her. Surprised, she blinked, her tears splashing her cheeks as her head slumped against his shoulder.
If you had your own child, you would understand. To watch someone you love disappear from your life over and over, not knowing if this will be the last time. That's not something our training ever prepared us for. I do understand,
Edge said softly, closing his eyes and pressing his hand between the hollow of her shoulder blades, his fingers sinking into the worn silk of her gown. It was the color of polished emeralds. He imagined his fingers twisting around verdant tendrils, the cloying scent of hyacinth and mist drowning his senses as a flash of ruby danced in the corner of his eye. She had come to visit him again, after 16 long years, a lithe phantom steeped in moonlight. He could sense her before he felt his body sway from the slight impression her knees made against his sinking mattress. When Edge opened his eyes, she was kneeling before him on his bed, her gaze flashing as she silently crawled forward, a spill of emerald framing both her heart-shaped face and the swell of her breasts wrapped in green satin.
Rydia.
Edge breathed, not daring to move. He knew what was coming next. 16 years had done nothing to erase the recollection of their encounters, delusionary or otherwise. Settling against the cushion of his down-filled pillows, he watched as her ivory fingers extended toward his face, delicately tracing the curve of the white scar bisecting his brow before curling around his throat, her thumbs running over his windpipe as gingerly as one would brush the keys of an ancient piano.
Why now?
Edge whispered, but of course, she didn't reply, she never did. Her lips tugged up in a half-smile as she began to apply pressure with her fingers, her nails leaving half-moon indentations in his flesh as her thighs straddled his hips to keep him pinned firmly in place. It hurts. Edge clenched his eyes shut, squirming helplessly against her as fire filled his lungs. His flailing hands found her waist, but despite all of his efforts, he couldn't move her 1 inch. The oxygen was now failing to flow into his bloodstream, and his muscles were ignoring the feeble commands bleeding from his brain.
Rydia.
Edge gasped one last time, knowing that any moment, the beautiful black curtain of oblivion would fall upon him, and it would be over. But this time, he dared open his eyes once more. It had been so long since he had seen her, and felt a blistering scream rise in his throat. Her face was mere inches from his as she arched over him, the tips of their noses practically touching, and he could see the fair spray of freckles that danced over the bridge of her nose. Her eyes were scintillating amber headlamps, and he could see a pulse of red throbbing deep within her pupils, beating with the rhythm of his dying heart. Edge shot up in bed, the scream tearing through the silence of his bedchamber like alarm bells. He clasped his hands to his mouth, panting as trails of sweat dripped down his temples. He was alone. A glance at the clock above his bed indicated it was only midnight. He couldn't remember when he had retired for the evening. The last thing he recalled was saying good night to Chisaki, and abandoning his dinner in the throne room. God damn it! Edge slid his fingers through his perspiration-soaked hair, letting out another strangled gasp. He could still feel the burn of her flesh on his, how it had simultaneously thrilled and terrified him to see her once more. But this time, it was different. Her eyes. They weren't the same, yet they were so familiar. Where have I seen those eyes before? Edge leaned over, shoving apart the blackout curtains that he had installed for the ease of sleeping in. Twin pools of moonlight greeted him, turning the sands of the Eblin Desert a milky blue. He pressed his lips together, shaking his head. The moon is getting bigger and bigger. Could that really be the same moon? The one that was home to Golbez and Fusoya, to Cecil's ancestors? Are the Lunarians back? I wish I could get rid of this unease in my heart. But everything's happening just as it was before. Just like when Ruby Kant stormed the castle. He swung his legs out of bed, shivering as his bare feet pressed against the cold stone floor. Once again, his gaze was drawn to the window opposite of his bed, still wide open. It was faint, but he could hear his name drifting on the wind. Something, or someone, was calling to him.
Your Young Highness! Your Young Highness!
Seneschal burst into the throne room, his sleeping cap hanging over his face with only one slipper on his foot, the other having been lost somewhere along the way. A guard, one of the ninja foot soldiers that took turns guarding the throne at night, immediately stood up straighter, blinking the sleep from his eyes as he jerked away from where he had been leaning against the throne. Seneschal hadn't noticed, however. He just immediately ran up to the guard and grabbed his shirt, throttling him like a woman who had just caught her lover with a mistress.
Where is Master Edge?
The soldier blinked, wondering if he should pull away or let the seneschal keep shaking him to help him wake up.
Sir, it is after midnight, he should be asleep in his chambers. What's wrong?
Seneschal shook his head, as if hearing that the king was sleeping at midnight was the most ridiculous thing in the world.
The Tower of Babel, that's what.
I knew it. It's back. A pillar of blood-red light pierced the heavens. This time, there was no coy flicker to make Edge think he was going insane. Shaking his head, he leapt down from the parapet, springing from the balcony of his bedroom to the roof access that would let him drop into the castle keep. If Seneschal wasn't panicking yet, he wanted to at least have the small pleasure of a few hours of non-nightmare-infested sleep before he decided what to do. But sure enough, when Edge burst into the throne room, the Seneschal was already there, drilling a new set of indentations into the bamboo flooring as the poor night guard watched on helplessly.
Seneschal!
Edge barked, and the elder statesman paused, his eyes the size of saucers.
Your Young Highness! The tower! I know,
Edge sighed, raising a hand.
I just popped in to make sure you hadn't keeled over from cardiac arrest. Now that I know you're safe, I want you to go back to bed. Are you insane?
Seneschal cried, marching over to Edge and jabbing a finger into his bare shoulder. It hadn't occurred to Edge until just now that he had effectively just paraded through the castle in his underwear. All he had been wearing to bed were linen knee-length bras that were worn through enough to leave little to the imagination if the light hit just right. Crossing his arms over his chest, Edge made a show of slowly taking in Seneschal's disheveled appearance.
You're in no condition to give me orders. I've got it under control. I promise I'll have a plan in the morning. Master Edge!
Seneschal shook his head.
None of the Eblin 4 have returned home yet. What kind of plan are you going to be formulating without them?
Still, no one has returned? Edge bit his lip, but quickly pushed the fears that were rushing up within him out of his mind. Now was not the time for panic. He couldn't have an entire castle fearing that the worst had come to pass yet again. There would be no way to control the mass chaos that would ensue.
Please, just calm yourself and go back to bed,
Edge begged, grasping the seneschal's shoulders.
Just give me one night to think, that's all I need. Your Highness.
The guard piped up from the corner, raising his chin.
I know you'll come up with something. You always do. And the castle guard can help with anything in the Evelyn Force place. Just say the word.
Edge smiled coolly, and the seneschal paused, staring down at his feet. He finally noticed that one of his slippers was gone, and a stain of red crawled up his face.
You are right. Again.
Seneschal offered, pulling away and shaking his head.
Thank you, your young highness, for taking the time out of your night to seek me out. Enough of that crap,
Edge sighed, shaking his head.
Just go to bed so I can hear myself think, all right.
He whirled around, marching back out the throne room and bringing his hands to his forehead. I can't wait for the Evelyn Four to return. I'm just going to have to believe that they are okay. At daybreak, I'll be outta here. Rydia was trying to warn me, there's something waiting for me at that tower. The next morning, Edge took more care with his dress, fastening on a pair of golden-plated shoulder guards along with his flowing silver-threaded and navy cape, which would serve to hide the collection of weapons he now had on his person. Flexing his fingers in the stiff, violet-tinted Genji gloves he had withdrawn from his old armory stash, he swept a small pile of miscellaneous supplies he had tossed on the floor into a leather satchel and strapped it securely across his waist to hang above his obi. Just as he was about to pass through the castle gates, he heard someone shout his name. Glancing behind his shoulder, he saw Seneschal staring at him forlornly, his hands on his hips.
Your young highness. You can't go off to the tower like you did before. That's your plan, isn't it?
Edge couldn't help but smile. Seneschal's impeccable timing to mess with his plans was as reliable as the sunrise and the sunset, you could set a clock to it.
I've told you not to worry about me. Besides, I made it back last time, didn't I?
The Seneschal's face crumpled into a frown.
But Cecil and the others aren't with you now.
Edge turned away wordlessly, pressing 2 fingers to his chest, his heart was fluttering anxiously through the pressed cotton of his shinobi garb. He could hear the Seneschal screaming after him as he submerged himself into the desert, but he knew despite the bluster occurring that no one would dare come after him. The only people who had ever followed him into the bowels of Babel had been the brave strangers that had saved his life when Ruby Kant left him to rot, 3 refugees from Baron and a young survivor of the Mist Massacre. Edge hadn't known it at the time, but the moment he had opened his eyes and saw the 4 strangers staring over his broken form, his life, and Evelyn, would be changed forever. You say my friends aren't with me now? But they are. They most certainly are. The Cave of Evelyn, which was actually a series of caverns that concealed an overworld-level entrance to the Tower of Babel, was nestled to the west of Evelyn Castle. Once accessible only by hovercraft if you were not trained in the art of water walking, the evolution of the tides thanks to the second moon's disappearance from their planet's orbit 17 years ago had caused the sea to draw back from the old shoreline, revealing a narrow path strewn with tide-polished rocks that shone like glass that would now allow most anyone to access the cave by foot. Since access to the Tower of Babel was forbidden, and no one had lived in the caverns for many, many years now, Edge had never bothered with returning since he had rushed through the labyrinth of the tower 16 years ago to save Cecil, Porum, and Palom from being murdered by the tower's century of clockwork monsters, reawakened by the mysterious doppelganger who had tried and failed activating the tower without having any of the crystals in hand. Although the world outside had certainly evolved throughout the years, the cavern seemed to be exactly the same, a small parcel of the planet that had been immune to time. Since it sharply descended beneath the ocean after you entered from the beach, it was always bone-chillingly cold and damp enough that one was almost always guaranteed to contract an illness if they spent too much time within. It had been a small wonder their remaining population had not been wiped out just by rampant disease when they had been forced to take shelter within. The staves of painstakingly dried-out driftwood that children would gather from the shores during the day so the adults could burn it for limited periods of time to cook and tend to the wounded was rotting in molded piles and in sconces that had been hastily installed in the cavern walls. None of it would any longer sustain a fire. Instead, Edge blew to life with a gentle exhalation a cluster of flame in his right hand, outstretching it a few inches so he could see where he was going. Not that he needed it, his feet were carrying him forward by muscle memory. He couldn't help but laugh bitterly under his breath. It was funny what his body was choosing to let him forget, like his mother's siren voice, and yet he could navigate this hellscape blinded. Taking a right into a descending path that took him away from the cluster of caverns they had turned into their refugee village, Edge crossed a shallow, narrow lake that filled his boots with stale, briny, algae-tinged water. He could hear the disgusting suction sounds his feet made against his boots echoing throughout the chamber as they lifted from the lake's bottom. In the middle of the water was a small mound of land, not big enough to accommodate more than one average-sized man. Climbing ashore, Edge lowered his hand, the glow of the fire washing over a simplistic gravestone that had been driven into the ground. There were no names etched upon it, not even the Eblin coat of arms. Father. Mother. You were buried out of sight. Just as you requested, ninjas to the end. Don't you ever get lonely, all the way down there? Edge shifted his weight, closing his eyes. And now that tower had been set into motion once again. But why now? How many times will our planet be put under trial? He bent one knee, bracing himself against the marker with his left hand while pressing his forehead to the jagged, unfinished stone. I know what all this means already. If only I had known 17 years ago what I do now about this wretched tower our family has been guarding our entire lives. Would I have been able to save you? A mournful howl rang out from deeper within the grotto, shattering Edge's trance and reminding him that he wasn't alone down here. The caverns were surely teeming with more undead than ever before, having been undisturbed for so long. He pressed his lips to the stone, shuddering as a metallic taste that reminded him too much of blood penetrated his tongue. I swear I won't let anyone go through that again. He rose, brushing his fingers over his lips as he plunged back into the lake. A few hours later, Edge had finally reached his destination, a dead end. His stomach was clawing itself with hunger. He had not been able to find anything worth hunting and eating in the caverns. There was nothing but golems and rotting, reanimated corpses that he made quick work of with his flame ninjutsu. He collapsed against a wall to rest, fumbling in his satchel to find something to take the edge off his hunger. At last, he found a half-used potion, removing the stopper and tossing the rest of it back in a way that avoided having as much of it splash on his tongue as possible. God only knew how old it was. Swallowing and closing his eyes, Edge closed his fingers to squelch the fire he had been using as a torch, and sighed. I'm back. Back to where I first tasted defeat. This had been as far as he had gotten 17 years ago when he had chased after Ruby Kent, having finally gotten a lead on who had attacked Eblin. It had been one of the lowest moments in his existence. Ruby Kent had quickly struck him down, and didn't even have the kindness to just finish him off. He had wanted Edge to survive the onslaught, to truly suffer through his humiliating defeat. If Cecil and the others hadn't found him, he probably would have dragged himself after Ruby Kent once more and gotten finished off for good. A rush of hot air tumbled into the tunnel, stinging Edge's exposed flesh. He opened his eyes sleepily, realizing he had been submerged in a sea of red.
Hey.
Edge blinked, looking around.
Am I dreaming?
A slender shadow was rising up the cavern wall that had contained the hidden entrance to Babel, two sinewy legs, with a tattered cloak fluttering behind them, the shadowy dance echoing the same effect as flames licking the side of a tower. Edge tried to climb to his feet, but felt as if his legs had become paralyzed. His commands could no longer reach them. Sweltering heat swirling around his form like a prison of flame, Edge doubled over, gasping for breath as his lungs filled with thick, ropey smoke.
Ruby Kent.
He gagged, and everything went dark.
Isn't it a little cold for you to be out here without a coat?
He watched as Rydia bolted upright, fat snowflakes tumbling from her curls as she frantically looked around to see where the voice had come from. Finally, she looked down and saw him standing in a pool of moonlight, her eyes narrowing.
And what exactly are you doing here? Sneaking about, as usual, I presume.
Edge grinned, leaping for the branch of a nearby tree and using it to propel himself upon the rooftop with the ease and grace of a professional gymnast. Plopping down next to her without ceremony, she rolled her eyes, scooting over a few inches to accommodate his lanky frame. Edge stuck his tongue out, catching a snowflake and delighting as it melted down into a petite puddle.
I thought the Misty Valley didn't get snow. It doesn't, usually,
Rydia said softly.
But I was telling the kids about my adventure to Baron to see Prince Theodore a few weeks ago, and I realized that none of them had ever seen snow before. None of them have ever left the valley. They're far too afraid of the outside world, even more so than when I was a child here. I told them if they were good, they would get a surprise tomorrow morning.
She raised her arms, which were wrapped in a green satin cloak.
So I summoned Shiva and asked for a little favor.
Edge shook his head, smiling. She was so damn cute, it almost hurt him to look at her.
That's really sweet. They're gonna be really happy tomorrow morning, thanks to you.
Rydia shrugged, lowering her arms and clutching her knees to her chest.
So, have you seen the baby yet? What baby? Prince Theodore, of course. Oh,
Edge laughed nervously.
Well, babies aren't really my thing, you know.
Rydia shot him a dirty look, and he grimaced.
Don't worry, I sent them my congratulations as soon as I heard. I'm not a monster. I thought that might have been why you were up in these parts,
Rydia said, raising her eyebrows.
Cecil and Rosa are your friends. You really should see them in person. I'm sure they're anxious to introduce Theodore to his Uncle Edge. You uncle?
Edge flushed.
I don't know.
Finally, Rydia smiled, giggling under her breath.
Sorry for making you uncomfortable. Although it would be cute if he called you that. He doesn't have his real uncle around, so someone is going to have to play the part, right? Ah. I guess he doesn't. Poor kid,
Edge mimicked Rydia, wrapping his arms around his legs.
That's gonna be one hell of a conversation if he ever asks about the Harvey family tree. Am I right? On the contrary, I think Theodore is incredibly lucky,
Rydia frowned.
Born into a family who already thinks the world of him, who will never know a world of strife and war, a prince who will be well loved by his people. If I could be reborn, I'd want all that too. What are you talking about?
Edge blinked.
You've got all that now, and you're old enough to appreciate it. Well, minus the royalty part. But there are ways to change that.
He grinned, giving her a wink, but all she could do was stare at him dead-eyed.
What exactly do you mean?
Edge flushed, pushing his hair behind his ear.
Well, I mean, Ashura and Leviathan. They're your family, right? And Cecil, and Rosa? Cain too, I guess. We've all become family, in a way. And the Mist villagers absolutely idolize you. I've seen it every day I've visited. And this piece. You've earned it, Rydia. You fought for it. It's time for you to finally enjoy it. That's why I wish you would spend more time in the overworld, so you could really see how much happiness you've brought so many people. Ha!
Rydia shook her head, tears springing in the corners of her eyes.
I don't think spending time here will be much of a problem anymore. What?
Edge leaned in, brushing his hand over hers.
What's that supposed to mean?
But she didn't reply. Instead, she lifted her gaze, focusing on the shining gravestone that had been erected next to a now frozen-over pond. What? What's going on here? Edge groaned, his eyelids feeling like sandpaper as he slowly forced them open. He was curled up in a heap on the cavern floor, but other than feeling like he had been kicked tirelessly in the stomach, he seemed fine. As he sat up, he checked himself for cuts and bruises, none of which could be found. None of his weapons or equipment had been stolen, either. Was that really Ruby Kant I saw, or was I suffering from some sort of delusion? And that dream? Why am I remembering something like that from nearly 15 years ago? He wondered how much time had passed, it felt like he had slept for days. However, there was no easy way for him to check, backtracking to the castle wasn't an option at this point, he had to resume his mission and break into the tower to see who, or what, was attempting to activate it. Closing his eyes, Edge quickly chanted the spell that would briefly break the illusion cast over the cavern wall before him. There was a flash of light, and a warped sector of space flickered before him, revealing a watery blur of bright white and pulsing blue lights. Stepping through the light, Edge found himself inside the Tower of Babel, staring down a long, empty hallway that he knew would deposit him in the belly of the beast, so to speak. Releasing the spell, the wall behind Edge became solid once more, ensuring no one could follow him. I'd never imagined I'd be going through here again, Edge smirked to himself as he made his way down the hallway, his now dry boots clicking cleanly against the shiny white glass tiles. I wonder if any of the mechanical beasts they keep in here are custodians? Place looks really good for not having been touched in 16 years. A spiraling tower comprised of revolutionary technology supposedly once built by the Lunarians themselves, the Tower of Babel spanned both the underworld and overworld, with the true entrance lying underground a short walk from King Jot's castle. For generations, Edge's family had guarded the tower. At the time, no one had known where the true entrance was, since it had not been known there was an underworld in the first place, and Edge had used it as a playground as a young man when he discovered the secret to entering the tower on the surface world. Back in those days, none of the hundreds of soulless, never-dying lights embedded in the walls would burst to life. The spotless, glazed ceilings, floors and walls, all made out of the same ethereal glass, were not graced by the presence of monsters, either. It had only been after Evelyn's destruction and Ruby Kent taking over the tower as his headquarters that it had burst to life overnight, fueled by the 7 crystals Ruby Conte's master, Golbez, had seized from kingdoms around the world. After the 8th and final crystal had been stolen, the tower became enshrined in an impenetrable light, and the pathway to the moon had torn the heavens asunder, paving the way for Zemus to extract his revenge on the populace of the blue planet. Edge knew that at the top of the tower resided a crystal room. He decided that was to be his goal. He had to be positive that none of the crystals had made their way here. With nary a window to be found, Edge had no way of knowing or seeing what was going on in the outside world. He could only pray things were going okay in Evelyn without him and that the Seneschal wasn't inciting mass panic quite yet. As he began his ascent, he became more and more suspicious about his lack of company. The last time he had been here, the place had been absolutely crawling with mechanical wraiths that were set to kill. It was after a couple of hours that Edge finally encountered his first monster, and it was in the worst possible place to do battle. He had been climbing a set of narrow glass stairs, where one false step would send him plummeting back to the first floor of the tower where he would take up residence as a bloodstain. A pair of bell pagers announced their presence only after it was far too late to run. Edge had to flatten himself against the stairs and cling to them for dear life as the monsters dive-bombed him and tried to pry him from the stairs with their claws.
Damn!
Edge hissed, wincing as a violent scratch that was ripped open on his forehead caused a trickle of blood to painfully blind his left eye.
Where the hell did you guys come from?
He closed his eyes, trying his best to summon any shred of concentration he could so he could fire off a smoke spell to buy him enough time to scramble up the last few stairs. But kept getting distracted every time a new slash tore into his garb and dragged across his leather armor. Some of the attacks were getting dangerous close to flesh.
You better not leave me behind.
A distant voice cried, and Edge felt his legs lift from the stairs as a savage cyclone of wind passed over him. Glancing up weakly with his one good eye, he watched as the twin bell pagers became entrapped in the whirlwind, spinning dizzily until their heads were smashed together, their knocked-out bodies dropped without ceremony and crashing into the glass below with a loud shatter. Edge's legs promptly fell back to the stairs, and he pushed himself up on his elbows only to see Tsukinawa standing before him at the head of the stairwell, grinning wickedly.
Tsukinawa!
Edge exclaimed.
You're still in one piece.
Tsukinawa extended his hand, and Edge took hold of it, allowing the boy to drag him the rest of the way up the stairs to the next floor.
My city's magic has nothing on our ninjutsu,
Tsukinawa smiled.
Not even the most powerful mage in the world could cast a gale spell like that. Of course not.
Edge grinned, and they bumped fists.
Let's go, master.
Tsukinawa gestured for Edge to follow him.
The others are waiting for us. The others.
Edge scrambled to catch up with him, shaking his head and reaching up with his scarf to swipe the blood away from his eyes.
I don't understand. How did you even get here in the first place?
Tsukinawa spun around so that he was walking backwards while he was talking to Edge.
Unfortunately, I was the last one to return home tonight. When I arrived, Gekao, Zangetsu and Azaoi were in a panic. Seneschal had said you fled to the Tower of Babel on your own, and he had forbid them from following you. What?
Edge blinked.
Why in the world would he do that? I would have thought he would have loved to sick some babysitters on me. I don't know the details,
Tsukinawa shook his head.
But apparently, monsters began flooding the Eblanessa desert from the underworld. The others had been fighting them off before I got home so that they couldn't reach the castle. Maybe that was why Seneschal didn't want them to go after you. What?
Edge froze in place, his fists clenched.
That many monsters that Evelyn needed the 3 of them to hold the horde back? How long has it been since I left? It's been 2 full days since the moon's return, master.
Tsukinawa frowned, and Edge felt the blood drain from his face. I was knocked out for well over a day in the caverns? What the hell happened to me? Tsukinawa, still walking backwards, was approaching a door that Edge knew from his previous romps through the tower would slide open upon contact. But as the whirling of the door's mechanics initiated, Edge saw billows of smoke begin to pour from the widening gap between the floor and the ceiling.
Tsukinawa, look out!
Edge cried. The boy ninja whirled around just in time to somersault away from a pair of fiery jaws snapping inches from his face. Two flamehounds emerged through the doorway, fighting each other to get through as Tsukinawa scrambled to his feet, running to Edge's side. Edge summoned a flood spell, crashing waves of crystal water briefly immobilizing the monsters as he reached to his belt to retrieve Masamune and Murasame and finish them off.
Tsukinawa, stay back!
Edge hissed, when another tidal wave, this one as tall as the ceilings, burst forth from the east, slamming the flamehounds into the wall and promptly electrocuting them as the water shattered the glass walls and drowned the circuitry the monsters were pinned against. The flamehounds collapsed in a smoking, steaming heap, bursting into wet, clay-like ash that splattered over the now disabled and permanently open doorway.
Master, you overexert yourself.
Izayoi joined them from the floor above, foregoing the now available stairwell as she leapt down and promptly swept into a bow before Edge. Edge shook his head as she rose, tossing her ponytail over her shoulder and resting her hand upon the curve of her hip.
Izayoi! You're here too.
Izayoi tilted her head, pursing her lips.
As you can see, I've completed my mission in Troya and have returned to you. Hopefully you won't treat me like a woman any longer, Master.
Edge's jaw dropped.
Are you serious? After everything that has happened, that's the line you want to open with?
Tsukinawa snickered behind his fingers. Izayoi cocked an eyebrow.
I place my status as an Evelyn ninja above my gender. Perhaps I understand a little why you sent me to Troya, but...
She shook her head.
I have an unwavering expectation that future missions make better use of my skills, not the fact that I have breasts and a...
Tsukinawa turned bright red as Edge made an odd choking sound. Forget about his weird blacking out spell in the caverns. What the hell had happened to her?
You've gone crazy, woman.
Izayoi took a step forward, yanking Edge forward by Haokao and pressing up on her tiptoes to stare him in the eyes with her trademark Ice Queen glare.
Not woman. Ninja. Roger that,
Edge gulped, trying very hard not to glance down and see how closely he and this not woman, who still felt very much like a woman, were pressed together. Izayoi smirked, releasing him and taking a step back. A sudden crash erupted from the floor above, and she glanced up, biting her lip.
We must hurry. Zangetsu is trying to clear a path for us. Zanjutsu.
Edge followed Izayoi and Tsukinawa as they bolted up the stairs.
Let me guess, he's the one who got you guys into the tower, right? Right.
Tsukinawa smiled.
He turned himself into his famous human kite form and helped us sail right on in. With our powers combined, it was no problem blowing out our own VIP entrance.
He giggled as Izayoi shook her head, slightly smiling.
Master, we wanted to wait until all four of us were together again before we pursued you. It would seem that our respective adventures paint quite the ugly picture for what may fall upon this planet. I fear that war is at our doorstep, and that it's only a matter of time before something terrible happens. My Cydia is fearful too.
Tsukinawa added worriedly.
Their most powerful black mage is gone, and they're pursuing someone named Kane Highwind to help defend the village in case there is a battle. But I couldn't quite figure out who they were arming themselves against.
Edge lowered his eyes, clenching his jaw under the safety of his cowl. Kane Highwind? Surely, that can't be right. The man hasn't been heard from in 17 years. I had assumed he was dead. As has the rest of the world, I would think. On the next level of the tower, they came upon Zangetsu waging battle against three proto-clockworks, slender blade-limbed androids that consisted of a round orb screwed onto a squat torso. As a shock spell lit up the room, the proto-clockworks began to emit sparks and turn on each other, frantically slicing at each other with their limbs and firing off laser beams that bounced off the walls and ceilings.
What?
Edge gaped at the chaos unfolding before them, and Zangetsu turned, waving his hand eagerly.
Hello, Master. Keep yourself focused. You wouldn't want to get hit by one of these. Ack.
Zangetsu screeched as one of the stray laser beams shot through his flowing yellow cloak, setting it aflame. Izayoi quickly put it out using a more delicate version of her flood spell, and Tsukinawa impaled each of the monsters with a shuriken to the head, finally ending their rampage on each other and causing them to slump to the floor with a sad boop noise. Edge pressed his fingers to his forehead, trying to summon some amount of zen.
Zangetsu. I'm glad to see you're safe.
Zangetsu smiled, patting Izayoi on the shoulder as thanks for her assistance.
I may be old, my lord, but I am well experienced. See that,
Edge replied carefully.
Did everything go okay in the underworld? It did, until I saw the Tower of Babel light up like a beacon,
Zangetsu sighed.
I made my way home as quickly as possible, but was shocked to find the desert swarming with monsters similar to those I had fought in the underworld when I emerged on the surface. I couldn't let them reach the castle, so I remained behind and fought all night. Luckily, I had some relief when Gekao and Izayoi were able to join me. He really was amazing,
Izayoi offered.
I think those dwarves taught you a thing or two about up-close and personal combat.
Zangetsu blushed, shrugging.
I still prefer to fight in the air, but I would be amiss if I stopped learning new techniques at my age, right? Where is Gekao?
Edge interrupted, and Zangetsu gestured above them with his spear.
He's just above, your highness. We scattered after our arrival so that we had the best chance of finding you. Shall we meet up with him? Absolutely,
Edge nodded.
Our destination is the crystal room at the top of this tower. Let's get Gekao and regroup, I'll explain everything then. Yes, master.
The three of them chanted. Rushing past the still smoking proto-clockworks, they took the next stairwell up, which took them to yet another featureless level of the tower. Gekao was ensconced in the corner of the room, finishing off two frost hounds that had surrounded him with a flame spell. As the steam began to dissipate from the monsters' corpses, Gekao squinted and waved his hands, trying to gain his bearings.
Master. Is that you? Yes.
Edge called out, and Gekao smiled, sheathing his battle axe over his back.
I apologize for my tardiness, sir. No apologies are needed,
Edge offered, and the four of them gathered around Gekao.
Did you glean anything from your journey to Damcyan and Fabul?
Gekao frowned, crossing his arms over his chest.
Unfortunately so. We're dealing with an unknown enemy, master. And from what I witnessed, she's very powerful, too.
Edge could feel a violent clench in his stomach.
Unknown.
Gekao nodded.
I think they arrived here on a meteor from the heavens, the shooting star some reported seeing the night before the moon returned. They? What?
Edge blinked.
That doesn't make any sense. I thought the only way you could come to our planet was by a path created by the interdimensional elevator.
Gekao's eyes widened and Edge tilted his head.
She mentioned that too, my lord. That very same term. Interdimensional elevator. I had no idea what she was talking about. You know what it is? I do. And it's not something good.
Edge turned away.
The only thing that is worse than the interdimensional elevator existing in the first place is someone else knowing about it. When all of the world's crystals are gathered in the Tower of Babel, the interdimensional elevator is activated, which effectively opens up a path to the moon. Anyone with the stamina and will can traverse it to cross between the two celestial bodies, and the moon just happens to house some pretty nasty powers that can purge us faster than you can say uh-oh. But didn't you destroy that threat when you traveled to the moon, master?
Izayoi asked.
And the giant of Babel was destroyed too, right? Is there really anyone left on the moon that is a threat to us? I have no way of knowing for sure.
Edge shook his head.
That moon has been gone from our orbit for 17 years. It's too much of a coincidence that a second moon returns to us at the same time as someone trying to fire up the elevator again. Whoever is on it wants that path open, and we're the only ones who can stop them, right here, and right now. Once we've ensured the tower is secure of any threats, we need to get in contact with Cecil and the others. They have to be on full alert to protect the crystals.
Izayoi and Tsukinawa exchanged worried glances, and Edge sighed.
What is it? It may be nothing, my lord.
Tsukinawa trailed off.
But Baron seems to somehow be already tied up in this,
Izayoi added.
Troya. They are openly warning troops that Baron has deployed the Red Wings. There are some citizens who are terrified war is going to break out between the two nations. It would seem that the reason they are in such a hurry to find a new epoch is because they want full strength in protecting the crystal. And they are pursuing the power of black magic to aid in their defenses as well. And the elder of Mysidia was seeking out an envoy to Baron.
Tsukinawa frowned.
Why wouldn't he send Porum to go to Baron, unless he was afraid she would be in some sort of danger there? This is insane,
Edge muttered.
How could all of this have happened in such a short time? Were my instincts right? Has the enemy already ensnared their claws in us, and it's already too late? Don't say things like that, master,
Zangetsu said softly.
Our mission is not over yet. Let's finish what you came here to do, and then we can take next steps. We'll support you, no matter what needs done.
Edge looked at each of the Eblin Four, each of which were nodding toward him, a strange tickle in his throat as a stinging sensation pierced his eyes.
Thank you, everyone. Let's go.
When they had finally breached the top floor, Edge spotted the familiar metal drawbridge that stretched across the center of the chamber, which was otherwise just a series of walkways that surrounded the perimeter of the room and met in the center, where the bridge would take one to the crystal chamber. He had learned long ago not to look down in this chamber. The dizzying height was enough to end it all if you were not able to keep your wits about you. The door to the crystal chamber slid open, and a young woman materialized in the threshold with turquoise hair and a gossamer white gown that was rendered transparent in the glowing blue lights of the tower. Gekko hissed for everyone to duck, and the five of them shrunk behind a pillar in a single line, their backs slammed against the wall.
It's her.
Gekko whispered.
Who?
Edge tugged down his cowl.
You know her.
Tsukinawa blinked.
She's the one who came from the meteor.
Gekko muttered.
I suspect she is one of the enemy leaders. She annihilated a group of Fabulian high monks in seconds, using magic I had never seen in my life.
Zangetsu peered out from behind the pillar, shaking his head in wonder.
Goodness. She's still only a young girl.
Edge gently tugged on Zangetsu's cloak so that he would turn back around.
So, what's our next move? We must avoid a frontal attack at all costs.
Gekko hissed. Izayoi bit her lip.
If you say so, Gekko, she must be very powerful indeed. But we have nowhere else to go, and if she's the enemy, we have to find out what she wants.
Edge frowned.
Watch yourselves, everyone. We must act carefully. I'll approach her first and see if she'll talk. Master.
Gekko protested.
Please, for once in your life, listen.
But Edge rose from where he was squatting, shaking his head and pressing his finger to his lips. As he continued down the walkway that would take him to the drawbridge, he could feel the same mysterious heat that had enveloped his body before he passed out in the caverns, and halted, watching as the atmosphere around him began to twist and bleed out into a hazy red sheen.
Edge.
Edge looked around, his heart throbbing tortuously against his lungs. The Eblin Four were still stuffed in their hiding place, mouths clamped shut. The young woman who was guarding the crystal chamber door wasn't even looking at him, she had turned her back.
Edge. Who's that?
Edge asked softly.
You cannot win against this adversary. What? Run. Run away from here as fast as you can. Run.
Edge protested.
Who are you?
Two specters appeared before him, an elderly man with a light silver beard and floppy silver hair, dressed in beautiful violet robes that were studded in jewels, a massive golden crown set upon his head. Next to him stood a woman with a deep frown that revealed soft lines at the corners of her eyes and ruby-red lips. She had red hair pulled back into a twist at the nape of her neck with a silver and sapphire tiara. Her gown was layers of deep blue silk, and a golden fur wrap was twisted around her neck and shoulders.
Father. Mother.
Edge gasped, pressing his hands to his mouth.
Was that you before? Were you trying to stop me from entering the tower?
In a flash of red, the two figures disappeared, only to be replaced by Rubiconte's scar-lined sneer and fluttering cloak of flame flapping against his bare, bloodied legs. Ruby can't. Edge let out a low hiss. He too disappeared, and the chamber went back to normal, filling with blinding, mechanical white light. Ignoring Rubiconte's little game, Edge marched up to the young woman, who turned to meet him when he was only a few steps away. The first thing he noticed, nearly taking him aback, was how similar she looked to Rydia. They shared the same heart-shaped face, ethereal complexion, and looked to be the same height and build as well. The hair was different enough. Rydia's emerald hair was naturally curly and unruly, while this girl's hair was bluer than green, and fell over her shoulders in delicate waves that looked to be kissed by the wind. When she turned her eyes upon Edge, he felt as if a bolt of lightning had shot through his spine. They were lightless, pulsing amber, the same eyes shining over his strangled form from his twisted dream, and realizing too late, the same eyes as the doppelganger from 16 years ago.
Some rats have burrowed their way in, I see,
the girl smirked, and Edge frowned. Rats? Plural? He glanced over his shoulder, and much to his dismay, saw Gekao, Zangetsu, Izayoi, and Tsukinawa standing behind him, arms crossed and staring daggers at the girl. He turned back to her, shaking his head.
You're the one who doesn't belong, I'd say. Master. Don't provoke her.
Gekao hissed under his breath. The girl tapped her barefoot against the shining tile.
What do you mean?
Edge took a step forward.
Cut the small talk. Why have you activated this tower? What is your reason for this? There's no use explaining to an inferior species,
the girl shrugged.
I would consider that small talk. What did you say?
Tsukinawa cried, and Izayoi bared her teeth.
You dare look down on us?
Edge raised his hand to silence them, his eyes never leaving the girls.
Inferior species? Yes, perhaps you have a point.
The Eblin Four glanced at each other, their jaws on the floor. The girl chuckled, reaching up and twisting a string of rubies and diamonds around her finger that was hanging from her neck.
You have some sense, I see. Well, I do my best,
Edge shrugged.
But you do realize that humans have the power to adapt, right? Adapt?
The girl tittered.
Don't let your guard down, master.
Zangetsu cried. The girl shot him a look, licking her lower lip.
In that case, it would be smart for me to settle this quickly. Settle what?
Edge demanded, and the girl pressed her hands together.
You don't need to know.
A glittering ring of yellow orbs surrounded the girl, and bursting to life before them in a womb of flames was Ifrit, the djinn of fire with pulsing red flesh and long, elegant green horns extended heavenward. Edge took a step back, his heart leaping into his throat.
Ifrit? Rydia's Eidolon. What's happened to Rydia? Who is Rydia? Another rat?
The mysterious girl chortled, and Ifrit reared up on his hind legs, a deafening roar ripping through the chamber as a wall of fire erected itself directly behind the Eblin Four, trapping them on the bridge.
Erg.
Edge grunted, watching helplessly as Izayoi quickly sprung into action, trying to drown the flames with her water magic. Unfortunately, she was to learn what Edge already knew, Eidolon magic was far different, and far stronger than any human magic. In a one-on-one battle, they were favored to lose, and quickly. The girl smiled, raising her hand and delicately curling her fingers.
You may die now. Ifrit. Feel free to cremate them or toss them over the bridge. Either one works for me. Not if I can help it.
Edge cried, extending his arms.
Everyone, grab onto me, now.
The Eblin Four complied, grasping Edge's arms as he executed the smoke ninjutsu. An upsurge of black smoke filled the room, causing the girl to gasp and cover her face while Ifrit looked around confusedly. Edge and the others appeared behind the mysterious girl and directly in front of the crystal chamber. Izayoi waved her hand over the chamber door to get it to open, but paled when she saw it would not budge.
It's locked,
she whispered. The mysterious girl whirled around, her eyes flashing as she snapped her fingers. Another wall of flame exploded in front of them, and she teleported through it, crossing her arms over her chest as Edge and the others backed up against the locked doorway.
You have nowhere to run,
she sneered.
This is over. You think?
Edge offered her a disarming grin, which made her blink in confusion and briefly made for a distraction. The return of the moon, the reactivation of the tower. My mother and father. And the image of Ruby Kent. Everything's happening just as it did before.
Your bravado ends here,
she cried, raising her hand in the air as crackling electricity began to spark and spit between her fingers.
No.
Gekao protested.
That's the same magic she used against the monks of Fabul. Everyone to me once more.
Edge cried, and when he felt the last pair of hands grab his body, cast smoke again. The mysterious girl lowered her hand, spinning in a circle as he scanned the chamber. Both ends of the drawbridge were still burning wildly, and Ifrit was squatting between them, patiently waiting for orders. The walkways around the perimeter were empty, and none of the doors had flown open. She clicked her tongue against the roof of her mouth, clenching her fist so tightly that her fingernails tore into the flesh of her palm.
Trying to escape the inevitable. Incomprehensible.
Where are we? Tsukinawa blinked, turning his head to cough out some of the smoke that had gotten into his lungs. Izayoi blew her bangs out of her eyes, glaring at Edge.
It's a dead end. Master.
Gekao scratched his head. He had reached the same conclusion as Izayoi from his brief investigation.
Why did you bring us here? Do you have a plan?
Zangetsu asked gently. Edge was standing in the middle of the crystal chamber, his finger tapping his chin as a small smile curled on his lips. The crystal dais was currently empty, that was a good thing. And if he remembered correctly, Cecil had just been standing just a little more to the left of where Izayoi was when. He gently took Izayoi's arm, tugging her a few feet forward and nodding. She snatched her arm away, wondering if giving him a hard smack across the face was something a woman or a ninja would do. A ring of light erupted over the locked doorway, and the mysterious girl stepped inside, shaking her head as the ring collapsed behind her into a glittering starburst.
What do you have in mind, exactly?
She asked tiredly, and Edge took his position just below the crystal dais.
Good to see that things haven't changed here, either.
He winked, pressing his foot back against the first of dais steps. There was a loud click, and the floor fell out from beneath all five of them in one breathless rush. Edge's laughter echoed menacingly as the other ninjas screamed, and the mysterious girl ground her teeth, stomping over to the trapdoor and peering into the endless depths. All she could see were waves of black. Zangetsu was the first to gain his bearings, clutching his cloak and calling out for the others to grab hold of him as they plummeted into the abyss. Once everyone had managed to grab some part of him, he curled his arms upward and arched his back, transforming himself into a parachute that initially shot everyone a few feet into the air before gingerly settling into a smooth, gliding motion. A few moments later, their feet touched the floor, and everyone pulled away, various cheers and sighs of relief ringing out. They had been deposited into a dark, empty room, but a thin line of light could be seen a few feet away against the floor, indicating there was at least an exit.
A trapdoor.
Gekao half laughed, half cried, shaking his head.
This place is like some kind of ninja stronghold.
Tsukinawa exclaimed.
I definitely want to train here someday. Amazing, Master.
Zangetsu smiled, and Izayoi looked up, letting out a shriek as a storm of fireballs began to bounce off the walls of the chute they had just come through.
She's coming for us. Forget her. Just keep running.
Edge demanded.
I know the way out.
He sprinted toward the door, throwing it open and flooding the room with the artificial light of the new level of the tower they had reached. The others peeled after him, Izayoi dashing away with seconds to spare before another massive fireball crashed exactly where she had been standing.
Who is that girl, anyway?
Izayoi huffed as they crossed through a new doorway, this time the staircase plunging downward. Ifrit's roar was unnervingly close, they could feel the stairway railing shake underneath their fingers as they fled.
A fraudulent summoner,
Edge growled, throwing open the new doorway and sending a metal boomerang careening ahead of them before any of them could push through the threshold. The new floor was teeming with clockwork soldiers that were all promptly decapitated. Edge reached up, catching the boomerang as he ran forward.
It's just the same as before. But how did Ifrit fall under her control this time? This time?
Gekao frowned.
Have you met before? If she's who I suspect she is, I would say I have,
Edge replied.
But funnily enough, she didn't seem to recognize me. Look out!
Tsukinawa cried. A fresh wall of flame had erupted in front of them, just as they were about to reach a new door. Edge and Izayoi leapt over effortlessly, and Tsukinawa jumped onto Zanjutsu's back before the old man launched himself into an improvised jump attack. Gekao came up from the rear, somersaulting over but nearly falling on his face for the landing. Edge grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet before he could stumble.
Here we go, you guys.
Edge smiled, his hand grasping a door handle that had been different than all the others.
This is our ticket out of here.
17 years prior. As Cecil's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw Edge approaching something huge and draped in shadows at the end of a wooden walkway. Running to follow him, Cecil only made it a few yards before Edge let out a loud whoop.
All right, we can escape in this. What is this?
Cecil asked warily. There was a popping noise, and Edge held up his hands, revealing that he was cradling a ball of fire to make a light.
An airship.
Sure enough, it was an airship before them. They had wandered into a hangar. The stained wood and painted emblems along the port gave away that they had come across a stolen Red Wing ship. Cecil felt a brief tug of nostalgia. It could have even been the ship he had once commanded, before he was stripped of his rank and branded a traitor. Everything looked just as he remembered from his final mission with the Red Wings, which had been the Mysidian massacre. Rydia had come up behind Cecil, shaking her head.
But it's an enemy ship.
Edge had blown out the fire and proceeded to release the ramp. With a loud slam, it smacked down into the walkway, causing a pile of dust to burst into the air.
Don't worry, I'm sure she'd rather be flown by us anyway.
They boarded, and Kane, Rosa, and Rydia poked around for suspicious people and items below deck. While Edge watched Cecil mess with the controls, everything really was just like before. Cecil could have flown this ship with his eyes closed. Everything was coming back to him.
You don't suppose this could be a trap, do you?
Rosa asked as she came back upstairs, giving up her hunt. She hadn't found anything out of the ordinary, which seemed even more suspicious. Rydia and Kane followed silently, still waiting for something to jump out at them. Edge shook his head.
This beauty? Not a chance.
Current day. Edge chewed on his lip as he was greeted with absolutely nothing. The hangar was completely cleaned out, there weren't even any spiders' nests. Edge stood at the edge of the dock, staring listlessly into the darkness with his arms wrapped around himself. Maybe if he thought about it hard enough, an airship would magically appear. Zanjitsu's staff was shaking in his hand.
It's a dead end. We're not going to have any choice but to fight our way out.
Gekao sighed, and his Aoi whirled around, feeling the telltale scorching heat wave that was the announcement of Ifrit's imminent arrival.
Master!
Izayoi howled, and Tsuki now ran up to her, gritting his teeth as he withdrew his twin daggers. He wondered if the others could see his knees knocking together in the darkness.
Ifrit. I won't let you hurt my cousin, or my friends. I don't care if you're an Eidolon.
Ifrit crept through the threshold, the mysterious girl floating at his side. She held out her hand, and Ifrit stopped, sitting back on his haunches obediently.
Are you done?
She asked, and Edge sighed, turning away from the ledge of the dock.
All right. You win.
The girl smiled in reply.
Ah. So you finally accepted the inevitable.
Edge shook his head.
I have to admit you got me. There is one thing I'd like to know before I die, though. Do you feel like entertaining a question? It depends on what it is,
the girl shrugged.
Try me. I may be feeling generous. Or I may incinerate you.
Edge pressed his lips together, and he swallowed the lump that had been forming in his throat. The entire time they had been running, he couldn't get Izayoi and Tsukainawa's warnings out of his mind. And with everything else that had occurred tonight, he decided that he just needed to be sure.
What's happening to Baron? To Cecil?
The mysterious girl widened her eyes.
Cecil this, Cecil that? You're another one of his fans, aren't you? In that case, I'm delighted to answer your query. Baron is gathering all of the world's crystals by the order of King Cecil Harvey.
Edge looked away.
Hey, I see. Well, now there's no doubting it.
The girl tittered behind her fingers.
If I may indulge in just a brief observation, I promise, it will only take a moment, and then I'll make sure your deaths are painless as a reward for letting me bend your ear. I just think this is also very funny. Funny?
Edge asked testily, and the girl nodded.
Yes, I've met so many humans these past few days who seem to hold a very high opinion of King Cecil. I've even met humans who claim the opposite, but I can see inside their hearts, and all I can sense is that tasteless sentiment I've learned you call love. But, despite all of this love people have for Cecil, he is a man that is truly, utterly alone in this world, a half-breed with one half of his soul on this planet, the other torn away, released into the infinite universe to forever wander. When he needed help, there was no one by his side, and now, he's... well...
She shrugged.
Taking matters into his own hands, I suppose. So I guess that either means that human friendships don't actually serve a purpose, or that nobody loves Cecil as much as they'd like to think they do. That's the part that tickles me so when I hear sheep like you bleat on and on about him.
Edge couldn't help it, his mind immediately flashed back to the last night he had ever spent with Rydia, on the roof of her house while the diamond dust snow rained down.
I thought that might have been why you were up in these parts. Cecil and Rosa are your friends. You really should see them in person. I'm sure they're anxious to introduce Theodore to his Uncle Edge.
But after that night, I used you as an excuse to stay away. I didn't end up meeting Theodore until he was at least 2 years old. Why did I think that was okay? Just because my ego was wounded? Because I thought Cecil and Rosa would take your side? Edge sighed at the bitter memory, taking a step backward toward the ledge of the dock.
You may think you know everything about humans, but our kind have a little something called instinct.
And with that, he fell backwards off of the dock, plunging silently into the darkness below.
Master!
Izayoi cried. Before she could stop herself, she fled from the mysterious girl in Ifrit, throwing herself over the ledge as well. Gekao shook his head, smiling.
I've sworn I'd follow you to hell. Guess now's as good a time as any.
He too jumped, and Zangetsu leapt after him, the sound of his cloak fluttering open as it caught the wind. Tsukinawa sniffled, taking one last look at the smoke pouring out of Ifrit's nostrils and deciding he would go ahead and take his chances with the rest. He tossed himself over the dock, his screams fading into oblivion as he fell.
Aoik!
The mysterious girl blinked, so stunned at what had just occurred that she needed to sit down. Collapsing onto the dock, she crossed her legs and pressed her lips together, her hair falling over her face.
Choosing death of their own free will. Incomprehensible. So, what do you think? Should we try the hangar, or just storm in from the front? Well, I'm always up for a good ambush. But maybe we should ask our senior battle advisor. Stop calling me that. Well, you won't tell us your name. What else am I supposed to call you? Crash. Ow.
Tsukinawa screeched, his head throbbing as he crashed into what felt like a pile of crates.
What? What?
He opened his eyes briefly, confirmed that he had indeed fallen into a pile of now shattered crates, and promptly closed them again. He wasn't dead, that was all he cared about for now.
Where are we?
Izayoi frowned, climbing to her feet and yanking Tsukinawa up along with her, despite his howling protests. Zangetsu and Gekao joined her, the latter of which was rubbing the back of his head, where he could now feel a cantaloupe-sized lump forming. High above them, propellers were slicing through the air, and they appeared to be floating over a sea of glowing orange, like the sun had melted into the ocean, and the rest of the sky had turned dark in its absence.
Is this an airship?
Gekao muttered, and they heard a high-pitched shriek belonging to no one they recognized emanate from the ship's bow.
Edge?
Edge was collapsed flat on his face, and Izayoi watched with curiosity as his back twitched with alertness when the woman's voice cried out. The woman in question had been standing at the steering wheel of the ship, stunned into silence when she saw the 5 ninjas suddenly appear from midair and smash into the airship's deck. Next to her was a female dwarf with a stylish bob haircut in a bubblegum pink mechanic's romper, and standing a few feet away, giving off an obvious air of detachment and perhaps a touch of disgust, was a tall, tanned man, wrapped in a black cloak and matching kilt, the rest of his well-cut form blatantly on display. The girl who had been at the steering wheel rushed to Edge's side, kneeling over him as a veil of waist-length emerald hair slid over her shoulders. Edge lifted his head and pushed himself up by his elbows, smiling dreamily up at her. "My daydream maiden. Is that really you?"
Hey, Rydia. I haven't died and gone to heaven, right?
Rydia blinked, falling back on her rear and shaking her head, still stunned.
What? I mean, why did you just fall out of the sky?
Edge hauled himself to his feet, groaning as he clutched his side, from which a small bloom of blood was seeping through his garb. A pile of contents fell out of his broken satchel, spilling over Rydia's lap. She glanced down, her hands brushing over a thin book that had tumbled out along with half-empty potion bottles and wrapping bandages. When she turned it over and saw the cover, her lips twisted in confusion as a crimson blush stained her cheeks.
Ah. And I see absolutely nothing has changed since we saw each other last,
she muttered, throwing it into his shin and standing back up as he sucked in a very large gulp of air in lieu of a scream.
Must have grabbed that by accident.
Edge groaned, shoving the magazine in his obi hurriedly and attempting to straighten himself, despite the ache that was now in both his side and his leg.
Anyway, to answer your question, I've recently discovered that history appears to be repeating itself, so I figured if I threw myself out of the Tower of Babel, someone would rescue me. Though I couldn't be sure everything would work out this time.
Zangetsu tilted his head.
So that was a complete gamble on your part, master.
Tsukinawa had turned pale, and would have fallen back into the crates, had Izayoi not been clutching his arm.
How could you be so reckless with your own life after all the lectures you've given us? Hypocrite. Yep, that's Edge's key descriptor.
Rydia deadpanned, and Edge ignored all of them, turning instead to Luca, who was grinning mischievously at all the delicious drama that was unfolding before her.
Hey, Luca. I love the haircut. Looking real good there. Well, thank you.
Luca giggled, drinking in his slender build and developing a very sudden appreciation for the Eblanessa arts indeed.
Not as good as you are, though.
Rydia rolled her eyes, turning away and pressing her hand to her forehead. Edge peered over her shoulder, finally noticing the man in black who had been staring at them the entire time, never moving an inch.
Who's that?
Edge blinked, and the man finally lifted his head, pushing a lock of dark silver hair away from his deep violet eyes.
Sorry to disappoint you, but we don't have time for a reunion right now.
Edge limped over to the man, grimacing as he clutched his side.
Hey? What is that supposed to mean? Rydia, where did you pick up this guy?
He tried searching the man's gaze, but the stranger quickly turned away, facing back toward the tower. Rydia stared at her feet, and even Luca had gone silent. Suddenly, the three of them realized that there was a lot of catching up to do, and none of it was going to be fun. Missed, 15 years prior.
It was you who built my mother's gravestone, wasn't it?
It wasn't really a question, or an accusation, just a matter-of-fact statement with a slight lilt at the end. Edge followed Rydia's gaze toward the grave. It really had turned out beautifully, exactly as he had imagined when he commissioned it. He couldn't think of a more fitting tribute to the savior mother of Mist Village, and the elder he had commiserated with to make it happen agreed full-heartedly that it was something Rydia would have loved to do, had she had the funds.
I wanted you, and the village, to have something to remember her by,
Edge replied quietly.
Baron and Damsyon were doing everything else, and felt, I don't know, fitting, maybe, that I could do something like that for you instead. I know how much you loved your mother, and I can only imagine she loved you more than the world itself. Being an orphan too. I felt that was how I could best relate.
Rydia pressed her fingers to her lips. When she turned back to Edge, the tears had started flowing down her cheeks. Still, she had not removed her hand from beneath his.
I thank you for it, truly. I cherish being able to look out upon her every day. It feels like she's still with me, in a way. And I appreciate everything else you've done for Mist's reconstruction, too. I know it has cost everyone so much time, money, and effort. And I know that the reality is, it may even be long after I'm gone that the village is truly able to thrive once again. The future generation has a difficult burden to carry. The children are afraid to venture in the outside world thanks to their parents' fears from the war, but they'll never be able to sustain a life for themselves if they continue to keep Mist isolated from other nations in the years to come. It's really another level of tragedy when you think of it that way.
Edge nodded. That had been something else he could relate to as well. Dragging Evelyn out of isolation was far more difficult than he had ever anticipated.
I'll support Mist for as long as there is breath in my body,
Edge pledged.
Maybe all of the work won't be done until long after we're gone, but I can do what I can now.
Edge. Rydia shook her head, sobbing against her hand.
I can't. I mean, I won't ever be able to repay you for something like that. Everyone, and you've all been too kind. How could I live with myself? Rydia. You have to know I want to do it, because I care.
Edge looked away.
And you wouldn't have to go at it alone, either. How many times do I have to ask before you believe that I'm serious about us?
Rydia grimaced, pushing her hand through her hair and closing her eyes.
I'm really sorry, Edge. I'm still just not ready. I'm not ready to give up on that part of my life yet. It wouldn't be fair to either of us if I ended up living the rest of my life in the Feymarch with the Eidolons while you were obligated to rule over Eblin. It would never work. I just can't promise all of myself to someone, knowing that possibility exists. The path I thought my life was going to take was twisted beyond recognition when the war tore through Mist. I'm still trying to figure out where I belong. I get it,
Edge muttered, pulling his hand away and rising to his feet.
You don't have to say any more, I know that the first chance you get, you'll go back to the Feymarch, and leave us all again. Did you ever think that the reason why you don't feel at home in the human world is because you won't give it a chance? You do realize you are human, right Rydia? Nothing is ever going to change that, save for reincarnation. Your commentary on the subject is unnecessary,
Rydia frowned.
It would do well for you to remember that you have no idea what you are talking about. You're not the only one who is confused,
Edge snapped.
I thought you cared about me too, if only a little bit. I do care for you,
Rydia cried.
And that's precisely why I can't play these games. If you cared for me as much as you say you do, you would trust that I am telling you the truth, and let this all come in time. I don't exactly have time.
Edge sighed.
Rydia. You understand my position, right? I'm a king now. And there are certain expectations. They want me to find a partner, they want me to have an heir, there are obligations that even I haven't figured out how to tactfully weasel my way out of, yet. I'm working on it, but it is exactly because I understand your position that I can't rush into anything. I just can't see myself being a queen, and being tied to the surface world forever. I'm sorry. I'm not someone like Rosa. It's not something I can ever envision for myself. So, that's it, then.
Edge shrugged, a bitter laugh escaping his throat.
We just go around and around in circles until one of us decides to give up our future for the other. I don't want that for either of us,
Rydia said softly, and Edge turned to her one last time, smiling sadly as he bent down to lift her chin.
I don't either. And being that is the only thing we can agree on.
He tapped the tip of her nose gingerly, and pulled away.
Then I guess there is only one way this can end.
He leapt down from the roof, landing effortlessly in the snow and brushing the flakes off his cloak before pulling it over his head and disappearing in a cloud of snow-strewn smoke.
Edge.
Rydia pulled her legs against her chest, resting her chin on her knees as she exhaled deeply.
I'm so sorry. Azura may have sent me away. But I'm not ready to give up on the Feymarch yet. With everything that has been stolen away from me, I need to make sure I've exhausted my every last chance at happiness.
Being by your side, along with Cecil, Rosa, and Kane. If I could ever replicate that feeling, I think that would be enough. But we live in a world now where that will never happen again. End of chapter.